Okay. I don't think I'll have a PowerPoint tonight. Still ironing out some of the technical difficulties. It seems like some weeks things work, some weeks they don't. And maybe that some of the problems on me. I don't know. But at any rate, there was a problem tonight that probably not going to be that much of a difficulty for us. The map is the only thing that regretfully I will not be able to show. But we want to talk about 1 Kings tonight. Last week we were in Proverbs again, but the week before that we dealt with 2 Samuel. So now we're moving right along to the next book in those 12 books of Hebrew history as we have divided them up into 12 books of. There was 5 books of law, then 12 books of history, and the next book is 1 Kings. Now the introduction for 1 Kings the introduction for 2 Kings will be very closely related to this one, and so that ought to open up some time next week to cover a little bit more of the practical lessons that we can get from the books. Both 1 and 2 Kings were originally one unbroken book. I think that was the same that was the same case with 1 and 2 Samuel. Also, 1 and 2 Kings were originally one unbroken book. Now, when the Hebrew Scriptures were translated to the Greek Septuagint in the 3rd century BC, which was Jesus' Bible, if you want to think about it that way, when Jesus was on the earth, what was the Bible that people were using in those days? The Septuagint. When he went to the synagogues and opened up and started reading and said, "This day is this Scripture fulfilled," what was he reading from? He was reading from the Greek Septuagint, and that was translated in the 3rd century BC. When the Hebrew Scriptures were translated into that Greek Septuagint, these books of 1 and 2 Kings were broken into 3rd and 4th kingdoms, and they followed the books that we just talked about, 1 and 2 Samuel, which they called 1st and 2nd kingdoms. And so they had 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th kingdoms in the Septuagint. And so what we're calling 1 Kings, to them would have been 3rd kingdoms. This book's narrative carries us through the remainder of the United Kingdom. That is, when the kingdom was one. When Saul and David and Solomon, when they reigned, the kingdom was one. But shortly after Solomon's reign, or immediately after Solomon's reign, the kingdom was broken in two. And so this book's narrative will carry us through that. It will carry us through the end of the United Kingdom, through the reign of Solomon, often referred to as the Golden Age of Israel, and into that period of the divided kingdom, covering a period of about 120 years. It starts at the end of David's reign, and David's death takes place in the very opening chapters of this book. And Solomon begins his reign, and it will carry us all the way through the reign of Jehoshaphat, somewhere around 848 BC. Now, Jehoshaphat was not the last of the kings, and so that's where 2 Kings will come in, and that narrative will continue from that time on until the end of the reign of all the kings when Judah was carried into Babylonian captivity. And so a lot of history is covered in these two books. Within that time frame, a lot of things are going to happen. Now, the books of Kings are not a complete history. That is, just by reading 1 and 2 Kings, there's a whole lot of gaps that we can fill in by other books of the Bible. I want to remind you that many of the minor prophets prophesied during these times. And so once we get to those books of minor prophets, sometimes people find it difficult to understand how those books, once we get to the minor prophets, those books are no longer in chronological order. Right now we're following these books of history and everything's in chronological order. One book immediately follows the book before it, and so on and so forth. But once we get outside of these 12 books of history, then we start getting into these books of the prophets, and different prophets prophesied through different periods of time. And so keep that in mind. This isn't a complete history, but a lot of the gaps can be filled in by the things that we read when we read in the minor prophets, and also the books of Chronicles, which we will get to very shortly. There is a relationship between the Kings and the Chronicles. The books of Kings give a history of both the northern and southern kingdoms, whereas the books of Chronicles just deal with the southern kingdom of Judah and the descendants of David. Of course, all of the kings in the south were descendants of David. That's not true according to the northern kingdom. Jeroboam was the first king, and Jeroboam was not a descendant of David, and nor were all the kings of the north descendants of Jeroboam. But what we find is there were several different dynasties. There was a lot of assassination and power struggles going on in the north. Very ungodly, immoral men as serving as kings in the north. And so this is not a complete history, but it's kind of more of an outline of key persons, key events, and the religious state of the nations during this period of time. The penman, the writer, is not identified by the book itself. It is likely that 1st and 2nd Kings were both written by the same person, since they originally were an unbroken book. Neither is there any evidence suggesting the death of the penman, like was in the case, remember, with Deuteronomy. We saw the death of Moses at the closing chapters of that book. And with Joshua, we had the recording of Joshua's death. In 1 Samuel, we had Samuel's death. But that's not the case with 1st and 2nd Kings. We don't know who the author was. The author was not identified within the book, nor is there a recording of the author's death. Both of these books, one continuous narrative, and so we can assume that whoever wrote it, wrote both of them. Jewish tradition has attributed both books to the prophet Jeremiah, and there is a lot of similarity between 2 Kings chapters 24 and 25 and Jeremiah chapter 39 through 42 and also chapter 52. Such similarity, it kind of gives weight to the possibility that perhaps Jeremiah wrote it. This is an interesting fact. It's clear that at the time that it was written, the first temple was still standing. 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 8 mentions the staves that came from that the ark was carried with, and it says it makes, I'm going to summarize, or best for my memory, it makes a statement such as still exists today. And so, in other words, the kingdom was still standing, and these implements within the temple could still be seen at the time 1 Kings was written. However, by the time we get to the end of 2 Kings, chapter 25, the last chapter, Jerusalem is destroyed. The temple is burned, and all the temple furnishings carried away to Babylon. And so, this seems to suggest that the book was evidently, if it was two books written as one continuous narrative, apparently this book was compiled over a period of time. And during the time 1 Kings 8:8 was written, the temple still stood. But by the time you get to the last chapter of 2 Kings, the temple is not standing. And so, we don't really know everything we'd like to know about this. It's possible that another inspired writer penned the last few chapters of the book. Maybe it was compiled at first by one inspired writer, and then the last few chapters after the carrying away into Babylon, another inspired writer compiled those last few chapters. Or, my opinion is, this is even more reason to believe that Jeremiah probably wrote it. You see, Jeremiah, this is one thing I always remember about Jeremiah. Jeremiah prophesied through the reigns of 5 kings. The last 5 kings of Judah, Jeremiah prophesied to all of them. And the first one during his prophetic ministry was Josiah, a good king. But the last 4 were all wicked. And then they were carried away into Babylonian captivity. So, say all that to say this, Jeremiah was in a position that if he sat down and wrote this, the temple was standing when he saw the temple stand. And he also saw it destroyed. And so I do think Jeremiah is a good suggestion as the person who wrote this. The inspired author makes extensive use of writings and records that were already in existence, and he mentions them by name. He mentions, quote, the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, end quote, and he mentions that 18 different times. He mentions that. 15 different times he mentions the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. And then one time he mentions the book of the Acts of Solomon. And so these were possibly official court documents and historical archives of the two nations kept by the royal scribes. And then compiled by an inspired writer, he pulled from these sources and organized this material and added what the Holy Spirit led him to add, is what I would suppose. What was the purpose of this writing, and to whom was it written? Well, the overall purpose of this book is history, to continue the running history of the Hebrews. His immediate audience would have been most likely the Jews living before and during the captivity. Perhaps we could expand that even to Israel as well. The purpose was likely to show their history, the history of their apostasy, to bring about their repentance. But then later on, after they found themselves in captivity, to remind them of the events that took place that led them to captivity, so that they might answer the question, why would God allow this to happen to us? Why would God allow us to be in captivity? They could read this, they could go back and read their own history and see exactly why they ended up where they ended up. The writer also wished to demonstrate the promise made to David being fulfilled, and that promise was in 2 Samuel 7:12 through 16. Remember, God promised to David that he would raise up one from his throne, and his throne and his kingdom would be established forever. And so several times throughout this book, something happens, something terrible happens when you think, well, God might just wipe out all of the Davidic line. And then it's made mention there that God punished them in some way, but for David's sake, he did not end the line. And so that's something that comes out at least 3 different times throughout the book. In fact, you want the verses? 1 Kings 11:34 through 36, 1 Kings 15:4, and 2 Kings 8:19. Summary of the book, the book easily divides in half into 2 different, if a real simple outline, chapters 1 through 11 is the reign of Solomon. Chapters 12 through 22, the history of the divided kingdom. And so it just real easily breaks right in half, the reign of Solomon and then the divided kingdom. But on that second half of the book, the divided kingdom, let's break that down a little bit further. We begin in chapters 12 through 14 seeing the divisions between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. We see the division, how that came about, and we see the tribes split and some going north, some going south under Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Then we see the reigns of Judah's kings in chapter 15, 1 through 24, reigns of Israel kings, 15:25 through 16:34, and then 17 through 22, the last quarter of the book is all about Elijah and Ahab and all the terrible things that happened during that time period. And so key events that happen throughout this book, we have the account of Solomon. If you want to know about Solomon's life, this is the go-to. And now, of course, in 1 Chronicles, or is it 2nd Chronicles? I think it's 2nd Chronicles, which has more in-depth, but more in-depth follows the seed line of David. And so we would also find the account of Solomon in the book of Chronicles, but this would be one of the locations where you would go. Chapters 1 through 11 is all about Solomon, his inauguration, his building of the temple, his wisdom, his wealth, his renown, and unfortunately his apostasy and his death. In chapters 12 through 14, we see the division of the kingdom. Why was the kingdom divided? Well, in short, because of Solomon's sins. Because he had 700 wives and 300 concubines, and those women, the scriptures specifically tell us that it was because of those wives that his heart was led away from God and he began worshiping other gods. And so as a result of that, God punished him and said, I'm going to take your kingdom from you, but for David's sake, I'm going to leave you a few tribes. Because remember, he promised David that he would have one set on his throne, that he would have one of his heirs set on his throne, and it would be an eternal kingdom. That kingdom stopped for a little while, but then, as we know, Jesus was ultimately the one who came, who was the seed of David, who will sit on that throne forever. It did end temporarily with Jeconiah, was the last king of David, last one of the seed of David, I believe, that occupied the throne. Or was it? There's a little intricacy there between Jeconiah and Zedekiah. Zedekiah was technically the last one to reign. I have to go back and study that to be sure on that. Anyway, when the kingdom, Solomon's sins was the immediate reason why God said, I'm going to split your kingdom in half. But then something else kind of acted out as a catalyst to that. If you remember what we'll call Rehoboam's folly. Remember Rehoboam, one of the first things that he did when he took office was the people said, if we're going to follow you, we want to know we want to know what kind of king you are. Your father levied all kinds of taxes on us for all his building projects, and he was so hard on us, and we're tired of it, and what are you going to do? And he said, give me a few days to think about this. And so he called the wise men in, the wise elderly men. He called them in and talked to them, and they said, well, what you need to do is if you really want to get the hearts of the people, you ought to be a little easier on them. And then he called his peers in, the guys that he grew up with, the guys he played with and had fun with growing up. He called them in and said, what do y'all think I ought to do? And they said, boy, you ought to let them have it. You ought to let them know, if you think my dad was a tough guy, you ain't seen nothing yet. He chastised you with whips. I'm going to chastise you with scorpions. Is that, I think, the way he worded it. My little fingers bigger around my daddy's waist was. And so and which way did he choose? He chose to go the way of all the young men told him. And so, and that was the catalyst that actually caused the dividing of the kingdom. 10 of the tribes left him. 10 of the tribes went to the north. 2 of the tribes stayed. The tribe of Judah and Benjamin stayed. The other 10 tribes went to the north. And just to be specific, remember the Levites were not counted among the tribes of Israel, and the Levites stayed. And so technically you might say 3 tribes stayed: Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. But the Levites were never counted among the tribes. And so normally you will hear commentators and read 10 went to the north, 2 stayed in the south. But you can add the Levitical priesthood to that as well. And so what's that mean about the north? The north doesn't have a Levitical priesthood. How are they going to worship? Well, that's one of the problems that Jeroboam immediately saw. And I'm probably getting into that a little bit too much for the time that we have available to us. Of course, this resulted in civil war between the two sister nations. As we read through the narrative, they're constantly at war with each other. The north and the south are always fighting. This resulted in a wholesale departure from God's system of worship in the north. I guess I will take the time. We've got another week to deal with 1 and 2 Samuel. We'll make it 3 if we need to. And so Jeroboam noticed this problem. He realized that since God's system of worship was to go to the temple and worship there in Jerusalem, 10 tribes had left Rehoboam and come and crowned him king in the north. And he thought to himself, if I allow the people to continue going to Rehoboam's territory and worshiping there in Jerusalem, eventually Rehoboam might win their hearts back, and they may leave me. God's the one that told him that he wanted him to. God told Jeroboam, I'm going to give you 10 tribes. He should have thought to himself, if God's powerful enough to give me 10 tribes, God's powerful enough to help me keep 10 tribes. But he didn't do that. Instead, what does he do? He sets up an entirely new form of worship. He sets up an altar at Bethel, which is the southernmost part of their territory. And he sets up another idol at Dan, which is the northernmost area of their territory. And he said, these are the gods that brought you out of Egypt. And you need to... I don't even know how in the world he sold this to the people, but they were very fickle people, I suppose. And they believed it. They went back to idolatry, worshiping idolatry. And he set up his own priesthood. You didn't have to be a Levite to be a priest. Why? Well, he didn't have any Levites, for one. And he did all this because he didn't want the people to go back to Rehoboam. He became the measuring stick that all other kings of the north were measured against. God said throughout the scriptures here that Jeroboam was wicked and did much wickedness in his sight. And then every other king that is brought to mention is said, and he walked in the ways of Jeroboam his father and did that which God disapproved of, or something along those lines. So corrupt leaders led the north into idolatry. There were several different dynastic changes. There was a lot of assassinations, hook and crook going on from one dynasty to the other. And the final result was that Israel fell to the Assyrians in 721 BC. Now in the south, Judah continued 135 more years. They actually had a few good kings, which preserved them just a little bit longer. But they were eventually carried away into Babylon, 546 BC. The ministries of Elijah and Elisha are pretty important throughout this book. As I mentioned, about a quarter of the book is focused on Elijah and Ahab, the conflict between Elijah, Ahab, and Jezebel, and then Elijah's appointing of his successor, Elisha. We see his announcement of God's judgment to King Ahab, and remember it didn't rain for 3 years because of that announcement that Elijah made to King Ahab. And of course that made Elijah public enemy number 1 on Israel's most wanted list, and he had to run for his life. Then there was that contest on Mount Carmel or Mount Carmel? I don't know. The same argument exists as for the candy, I guess, for the place, in the Bible place here, at least in my mind. I don't know how to pronounce it. I want to say Carmel, I want to say Mount Carmel. Maybe that's right. And then we read about, as a result of that, he put to death all those prophets of Baal, and that made Jezebel furious, and so she sought his life, and then he had to run again. So we read about his flight from Jezebel, and he goes all the way to Mount Sinai, to Horeb, the other name it was called by was Mount Horeb. That's a long flight, folks, from Israel all the way to the Sinai Peninsula. He ran a long way. I think it's an interesting note here that with Solomon's death ended the period where God dealt with nations through the kings. Instead, throughout this period, because of the wickedness of the kings and because of their great influence, instead God starts dealing with his people through the prophets during this period of time. And so maybe that's why we see the transition in this book that is titled 1 Kings, but then the last quarter of the book is all focused on Elisha and the prophet of God, or Elijah, the prophet of God. All right, I'm going to skip over the section of the key places in the book. It's a good thing because it looks like I accidentally deleted 2 of them. But I was going to decided I'll skip over them for time's sake, and we'll look at that next week when we have the maps available. We'll look at the locations for both 1st and 2nd Kings on the maps. So what are some great lessons that we can learn from 1 Kings? I think the number 1 lesson from this book is the value of obedience and righteousness to God. There's a saying, as the king goes, so goes the nation. And that certainly, we see this principle play out through the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, When the leaders of the nations were righteous, seems like the majority of the people followed suit and they were righteous and the nation prospered. However, when the rulers were wicked, the majority of the people seemed to follow suit and the nation diminished. Kind of see that in America too, don't we? as long as we have lawmakers who are ungodly, seems like the number of ungodly people in the country multiply. But when we have godly leaders, it seems like the nation tends to lead that way. In the books of Kings and Chronicles, the rulers were appraised by God, and it was not based on their political, economic, or social grounds, although sometimes those things are mentioned. Sometimes it is mentioned that this king made this political or economic decision and it helped the nation, but they were not graded by God on those matters, but rather on the religious grounds. It is either said after a king, after the deeds of after a summary of the deeds of a king are mentioned in Kings and Chronicles, following that we read either something along this line, he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, or we'll read, he did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord. At the end of every one of them, you will read that. And so the account is given of a king, and then when it gets to the very end, the summary statement is, not he made Israel to prosper, he made great social reforms, but he either did what was right in the sight of the Lord, or he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. God had warned his people long ago when they came into the land that they would either be blessed or cursed depending on such factors, and he urged them to choose the way of blessings in life. The same truth applies in every nation, I believe, in every period. I believe the Scriptures teach that, even though God may not work in the lives of men today in the miraculous ways that we often read of in Scripture, I still believe that those statements made concerning prosperity and godliness still will carry on through the end of time. For example, Proverbs 14:34, righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. I believe that's still true today. I believe we can just see it happen, right? Or Psalm 9:17, the wicked shall be turned into hell, and all nations that forget God. Kind of chilling, isn't it, to even think about some of these verses. Psalm 33, verse 12, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, and the people whom he hath chosen for his own inheritance. And so we should have no misunderstandings or misgivings about where the current trends in our nation are taking us. To some degree, I think maybe we're victims of circumstance. As we pointed out, whatever direction the leaders of these nations that we read about, whatever direction they went, it seemed like the people followed suit. And so to some degree, we're victims of circumstance. Our leaders are pointing the nation in the direction it should go. But we should do everything to uphold righteousness, right? We don't have to follow them. In fact, even when Elijah thought he was alone in the world, God said, I still have reserved unto me 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. And so sometimes when we think we're the only one left, there's still more out there. And we don't have to follow our ungodly leaders. I think we should pray for God to raise up better leaders. And if we can, elect better leaders. If we can, we ought to. And this brings me to, I try not to get into too many political topics in my preaching, but, if it was a biblical topic first, I feel like it's free reign, okay? And I believe this is a biblical topic before it was a political topic, okay? I often hear people around election time say something like this, neither candidate is a Christian. Both of them are sinners. The lesser of two evils is still evil, and so I just can't vote for either one of these people. I would like to point out something in regard to this from the book of Kings for you to consider. In 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 25, we read, God said this of Omri. He said, but Omri wrought evil in the eyes of the Lord and did worse than all that were before him. Omri did worse than all the kings before him. And then we read of Ahab. And Ahab, the son of Omri, this is chapter 16, verse 30, and Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him. Would it be fair from those two verses for me to say that God does recognize when one ruler is more evil than the other? Is that true? Now, I understand that when it comes to sins in our own life, we can lose our soul over any sin, right? But that doesn't mean that God doesn't know that God doesn't understand the concept of one sin being more heinous than the other. That doesn't mean that God doesn't see the propensity of evil and the influence of evil can be worse with one person than the other. Since we know that the influence of rulers affect the moral compass of a nation, would it also be fair to say then that God would prefer less wicked people to rule? Since their influence is so great, and since a ruler can cause a whole nation, the trend of a nation, to go one way or the other, do you think God would prefer less wicked people to rule than more wicked people? Yes. That being the case, what importance should that be to us? Should we not do everything possible to see that God's will be done? Should we let campaign promises related to our own pocketbooks and national economy and politics and social concerns or anything else like that outweigh our concern for righteousness in this nation? That's as political as I'm going to get, but friends, that's biblical. That's biblical. These wicked people drove these countries in the ground, and I'm not talking about economically, I'm not talking about socially, because they turned their backs on God. We have rulers in our own country that are doing the very same thing today. We need to quit worrying about our pocketbooks and quit worrying about social concerns that make me feel self-righteous, You got all these social concerns out there. Well, I believe we ought to save the spotted owl over here. Well, I believe we ought to stop drilling over here and all these green things. All those things are good things to pat ourselves on the back about, but are they more important than the righteousness in our country? Okay, I'm going to stop because I don't want to get too political here. But I believe this is a biblical issue that we see in the book of Kings specifically. We could look at it. In this book, we find lots of good character studies. The life of Solomon is a great character study. I'm not going to go into the life of Solomon because I feel like I've kind of touched on that by sermon a lot here lately. Lots of good lessons about Solomon, though. We could talk about the life of Elijah. We could talk about the life of all these different kings and even Jezebel, the queen, and lots of good lessons. In fact, some of you might remember a series that I taught, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Anybody remember that? Where I looked at different kings throughout the history of Israel and Judah. Is that the second bell? Am I out of time? I have a few minutes according to my clock. Here's some other various minor lessons from the book. There's a lesson in the wisdom of aged people, I believe, in that demonstrated by Rehoboam's folly. Rehoboam, he just totally ignored the wisdom that is found in what the Bible calls the hoary-haired people. When the Bible says hoary-haired, it means gray-haired. Biblically speaking, there's a lot of wisdom in people with gray hair or no hair. In some of you's case, I guess I didn't want to leave y'all out. There's a lot of wisdom in aged people. Rehoboam rejected that to his own demise. Here's a lesson that I think gets kind of forgotten sometimes in the life of Elijah, and that is a lesson about discouragement. When Elijah, when he won that great victory on Mount Carmel, and all those prophets of Baal were put to death, you know, you would think he was on cloud nine. The greatest thing has happened. And I guess maybe he expected that there was going to be a wholesale turning to God from all the people, but that's not at all what happened. In fact, he got a death threat. He had the most powerful man and woman anywhere around after him, saying, by this time tomorrow, you're going to be dead. And so he fled. And then he became so discouraged, at one point he even cries out to God and says, just let me die. Just let me die. You know, discouragement is one of the most devastating enemies to the servant of God. I know as a preacher, I faced it many times. Discouragement can be a real problem. When one believes they cannot succeed, they inevitably do not try hard enough, and they fail to reach their goals. And even Elijah suffered from discouragement. He was even so distressed, he expressed the desire to die, chapter 19, verse 4. Thus we see even the greatest of men can suffer from discouragement. Why was he discouraged? First of all, he was physically exhausted. He had fled for so long, he had pushed his body as far as he could push it. So he was physically exhausted. God gave him food and rest. Second, he was afraid. Third, he thought he was a failure. He said to God, I am not better than any of my fathers. So he was afraid, he was tired, he was thinking he was a failure. And fourth, he didn't have any support. He had a total lack of support. Now, he thought he was the only one left faithfully. God informed him, no, there's 7,000 of them who still haven't bowed the knee to Baal. But where were the 7,000? They certainly weren't supporting Elijah. And so, a lot of good lessons about discouragement from the account of Elijah. We'll stop right there. I've saved one lesson, as I usually do, for an invitation for us in just a few minutes.